Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Welcome to the Kinder Institute Colloquium Series. I am Lauren Feldman, a historian here at the Kinder Institute, and it is my very great pleasure today to be introducing our Kinder Colloquium speaker, William J. Novak. Bill Novak is the Charles F. and Edith J. Klein Professor of Law at the University of Michigan. He teaches in the fields of legal history, legislation, and regulation, and his research interests focus on the history of the modern American regulatory state. Novak previously was a professor of history at the University of Chicago and a research professor at the American Bar Foundation. In 1996, he published The People's Welfare, Law and Regulation in 19th Century America, which won the American Historical Association's Littleton Griswold Prize for Best Book in the History of Law and Society. In 2023, he published a sequel, New Democracy, The Creation of the Modern American State, which also won the AHA's Littleton Griswold Prize, as well as the Morgan Prize for Best Book on the History of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. In addition to some 50 articles, he has also co-edited 4 additional books: The Democratic Experiment, The State in U.S. History, The Corporation and American Democracy, and Anti-Monopoly and American Democracy, all with a really illustrious series of co-authors. He's currently at work, and this is, I think, what we're going to be talking about here today, on a new legal history of the American founding from the perspective of law, regulation, administration, and statecraft. In addition to all of this, I can affirm definitively that Professor Novak is an exceedingly warm and generous intellectual colleague, as he's just coming from spending 6 hours leading a workshop on my book manuscript when we had never interacted previously. And so for that, I'm so very grateful. Just to talk about the mechanics, Professor Novak is going to speak for about 45 minutes or so. Then we'll open up for a Q&A, which I'll pass around this very microphone for. And after that, everyone in this room is warmly invited to attend our Pursuit of Happiness Hour, which is just adjacent to this room. And with that, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Novak.
Yeah. I don't think I need that anymore. Okay, well, thank you so much for that, Lauren. Thank you all for coming. As Lauren said, we just had this spectacular conversation on her book manuscript, which went for a really good substantive session. Thanks to all the colleagues who also came in from around the country to join in that conversation. And special thanks to everyone here at Kinder. I mean, terrific hosts, Jay, Billy, everyone. Thank you for having me. So let me just jump right in on this. So I never expected to be writing a book on 18th century history, and there's some 18th century historians in here, so I'm a little apprehensive about this, but here I go. There you go. To the contrary, all of my previous historical training, research, writing has been focused exclusively on the 19th and 20th centuries, tracing the historical development of robust American traditions of legislation, regulation, and administration. In contrast to pervasive myths about a pre-New Deal American legal political inheritance defined primarily by private individual rights, a weak state, formalist constitutional limitations, and laissez-faire political economy, my work has tried alternatively to probe the deep historical roots of American public rights, American public law rather than private law, popular lawmaking, the legislatures, and surprisingly energetic state regulatory and administrative technologies. Going forward, I didn't plan on going to the 18th century. I fully intended on taking the story forward into subsequent analyses of New Deal and kind of post-war American policy. And then the sources intervened, as they always do. If you're working from the primary sources, they tend to interrupt your best laid plans. So let me tell you a little bit about that story. Midway through research for this most recent book, New Democracy, that Lauren mentioned, and yes, I have lots of good friends on the Littleton Griswold committee, which is really what's key to these things. I came across this crazy, unusual source. So I was in the Michigan Law Library, right, and I'm researching early 20th century American political regulation and taking particular interest in the extraordinary aggrandizement of presidential power, public power, executive power during the Woodrow Wilson administration. Okay, that was my question. Without question, one of the most important episodes in the growth of the modern American state and the modern American executive and presidency took place on Woodrow Wilson's watch. During World War I, Wilson infamously launched an audacious program of legislative, executive, administrative, and central state action that included such expansive initiatives as conscription, espionage and sedition acts, massive immigration restriction, what people called at the time a deportation mania in the heat of World War I, national prohibition, the nationalization of the railroads, and the radical experiment in across-the-board domestic price regulation known as the Lever Act, the Food and Fuel Control Act of 1917. That's really, really important. Lots of stuff is going on there. By December 1917, Wilson's war and emergency mobilization included over 22 major acts of Congress, from the National Defense Act to the Trading with the Enemy Act, 20 presidential proclamations from unlawful exports to the licensing of fuel oil industry, and 22 executive orders involving things like German U-boats to the organization of the Food Administration and the Grain Corporation. These are kind of federal corporations, interestingly, chartered in Delaware still, but they're federal national corporations. As Senator James Reed complained at the time, quote, "The power demanded is greater than has ever been exercised by any king or potentate on earth. It is broader than that which is exercised by the Kaiser over the Germans. It is a power such as no Caesar ever employed over a conquered province in the bloodiest days of Rome's bloody despotism." Okay? So in coming to terms with this unprecedented wave of modern state building, which is the stuff I study, I was especially interested in where the Woodrow Wilson administration came up with defenses or precedents for this extension of presidential and executive authority. So I'm in the law library looking for these things. Told you I would do this. And I see this crazy volume. Okay, so it's this crazy volume from 1917. And it's just entitled, it's in the law. This is why our stacks should always be open so we can stumble upon these things and find new discoveries. It's entitled simply Emergency Legislation to December 1917, okay? So it's a 1917-1918 U.S. Department of Justice Commission study on emergency legislation that had been passed already in the United States prior to the present emergency. The volume was actually compiled by one J. Reuben Clark at the direction of the Attorney General and the President himself. The intent of the study was to collect, annotate, and index all historical precedents now for this most recent spate of ramping up executive and national state authority during World War I. The bulky volume, as you see, ultimately weighed in at over 1,100 pages of previous U.S. legislation prior to the Wilson administration's innovations. And so this is one of those things where you can go wrong. So when I first pulled this volume down from the library shelf, I thought I already knew what was going to be in it. I'm like, okay, emergency legislation to December 1917. Of course, what I thought I would find, right, is a compilation filled with Civil War era precedents from the Abraham Lincoln extension of presidency. What some people talked about as a constitutional dictatorship, as Lincoln ramped up presidential power as well. And in fact, the volume does contain 50 pages of statutes from the Civil War period. There are also 30 pages from the War of 1812, but what I fully didn't expect to find in an 1,100-page volume of state emergency legislation was a total and complete preoccupation with the actions of the American state legislatures during the American Revolution. Nearly 800 pages of this volume are taken up with a detailed catalog of what our state legislatures were doing at the very first moment of sort of inception, both the Continental Congress itself in its early years, but more importantly, all the state legislation ranging from states from Connecticut to Virginia. The 800 pages of statutes compiled by the Wilson administration provide an early indicator of the title of my talk, these robust traditions of legislation, regulation, and yes, delegated administration that are there at the very heart of the American founding, literally in the first original days of independent American state activity. It's an origin story, and it's about this thing we might not expect to. I certainly didn't expect to find it, and I study a powerful state in the 19th and 20th centuries, still didn't think it was there that early. In almost all the states, legislatures began by taking firm control of state trade and political economy and aggressively policing fraud and wartime opportunism. Connecticut passed, for example, an act to encourage fair dealing and restrain and punish sharpers and oppressors that required a license to purchase any of the following products: rum, sugar, molasses, tea, wine, coffee, salt, cloth, stockings, shoes, leather. I can go on, I won't. Such licenses were to be granted only to individuals, quote, of good character, for probity, public spirit, and friends of freedom and independence in the American state. In 1778, commissioners from 7 states gathered at New Haven and agreed to now even more aggressively regulate the price of labor, manufactures, internal produce, and imported commodities. The Connecticut legislature ordered prices returned to 1774 levels across an encyclopedic list of commodities from good merchantable wheat, peas, and white beans. The detail of these things is important. At 9 shillings and 9 pence per bushel, this is price fixing in the first days of the American independence, to common steel made in America at 1 shilling and 4 pence per pound. Beyond such basic economic price controls, all of the revolutionary states aggressively legislated to provide adequate remedy for, of course, the militia and the armed services, and to make sure they're well provisioned. Maryland passed ample and detailed statutes for, wait for it, the quartering of soldiers in the houses of other inhabitants. To procure clothing, of course, for the American army, to secure and, if necessary, impress, i.e. seize, take private property, vessels, and carriages for this larger public purpose, to procure a supply of salt meat. I have read more about salt and saltpeter than I ever. This is the hazard of being an 18th century historian. The Maryland legislature prohibited the distribution of grain into spirits. No alcoholic beverages here during the course of the war, and regulated auctions. Other states followed suits with equally aggressive legislative measures, distinguished primarily by exclusionary and, yes, racially discriminatory customs and habits, just all over the place in these statute books. Georgia, for example, there's just one example, passed a law requiring slaves to work, this is the quote of the statute, slaves to work on several forts, batteries, or other public works throughout the state. All right, the catalog of early regulatory legislation continued ad nauseum. The detail and elaboration of each of these statutes went on for hundreds of pages. The early American state legislative records, our earliest American state legislative records, were replete with powerful statutes regulating nearly every aspect of state economic and social life. The public powers exercised in the name of wartime necessity, public safety, and public welfare were as extensive as anything I could imagine, from fixed prices to forced labor to the expropriation of needed resources, shelter, food, clothing, and transportation, and the like. In a period when historians have tended to primarily emphasize personal rights, bills of rights, and individual liberties, the state legislatures passed laws requiring the quartering of soldiers, the disarming of loyalists, and new definitions of treason and the punishment of traitors. The empirical record is one of emergency, necessity, strength, and power, a force strong enough, we have to remember, to defeat British imperial authority at one of the heights of its powers. The socioeconomic policing of the early American state legislatures was a key element in this revolutionary reorganization of society and economy so as to defeat the British. But these precedents will go on to create a foundation for extensive American state power and all the stuff I do research more of, that is the 19th and 20th century periods. So with this rather surprising primary source discovery, I've been forced to rethink the entire future and chronology of my research agenda. Didn't plan on it. My two previous legal history books, as Lauren suggested, basically can be seen as sequential installments, building an ongoing revisionist history of law and statecraft in America after the founding, starting in the early Republic with this book, People's Welfare and Law and Regulation in the early 19th century, which challenged prevailing understandings of the pre-Civil War period as basically a land of laissez-faire, where governments mostly left private property owners and freewheeling economic contracting alone. In contrast to those myths, right, myths of individualism, of laissez-faire, the book documents in actual cases and primary legal materials America's long and extremely detailed history of governmental police power regulations across 5 areas of policymaking. I could have added others, but 5: public safety, political economy, public property, public morality, and public health. We robustly regulated those things throughout the early Republic. My second monograph then, where I discovered this book, published just a couple years ago, New Democracy, Creation of the Modern American State, then took that legislation and regulation story forward in time. I should say this formulation of talking about legislation and regulation, one of the more important innovations in law school education in recent years has been the adoption of a first-year course, because now lawyers are really realizing how important legislation and regulation is to law in America, called legislation and regulation. We call it LegReg. And you just see it all over the place in this period. But that took the story to the New Deal. The book also examined 5 areas of transformative legal development concerning the state police power. Happy to talk more about that in Q&A. Public utility, really happy to talk about that in Q&A. Social legislation, social regulation, regulation of intimacy, we might say, anti-monopoly, and then also administrative law per se. I think that second revolution in regulation amounted to another major transformation of American public law before the New Deal, a transformation in techniques and technologies of legislation, regulation, and administration that ultimately made the New Deal possible. Right? It takes more than a charismatic president in an economic crisis to create a New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt was building on 2 generations of legislative, regulatory, administrative innovation. Okay, so it's fair to see the second volume is a direct sequel, and I thought I was done with a legal history of the American regulatory state from the first days of the Republic through the New Deal. I was preparing for retirement, and then I stumble on this volume. So as you gather from the title of this talk, I now need to follow, I think, this discovery to its logical conclusion. What does this mean? What are these precedents about? So this year I've just started working. I'm still in the beginning, and I really welcome your questions and your challenges and suggestions to go back and write now the original prequel to it all in Star Wars fashion. Now I'm all out of order, and I've got to get volume 1 here. Trying to retool as an 18th century historian, no mean feat, especially in the 21st century. It would have been much easier in, I don't know, 1950, there's not as much to master. But to go back to the future, take a fresh look at the American Revolution and the founding period by again trying to examine what legislators and regulatory councils and committees, I'll talk about these more in a second, of inspection and safety, committees of safety, really important to the American Revolution, what these entities are actually doing, as opposed to what we usually do when we talk about the founding, concentrate on what some of its most famous founders were saying. Focusing on the doing, what are these people trying to do with the power? Maybe that will tell us what they're really about, as opposed to what they're strategically, rhetorically saying in speeches meant to convince people about other things. Akhil Amar's most recent book, he talks about the biggest founders as the Big Six. Okay, so the Big Six, and you look at the words of these Big Six founders and really try to decipher, according to Amar, what he calls in the title, the words that made us. The words that made us, not the deeds, not the practices, not the laws, not the institutions. The words are making us. As if the American Revolution and the founding was some kind of academic literary event, or worse, philosophical musical theater. It's a theater production. There is a necessary continuity of theme across this trilogy as a whole, as my goal throughout has been to map and retrieve this alternative public law tradition of active governance and statecraft on the ground in the US from the very beginning to the onset of our own time. Okay, so together the volumes constitute this kind of continuing effort to debunk persistent, I think, dangerous myths and fallacies about an original American historical tradition defined primarily by pre-commitments to private individual rights, formalistic constitutional limitations, and laissez-faire political economy. That's just not the record on the ground, much as we talk about those things, much as I'll say in a second, I believe them for a very long time. All right, so one key question every author has to ask themselves is, why would I use my precious short time on earth writing a book on this particular question? And for me, it now becomes, why in the world would I want to write 3 books, trying to just investigate this? And for me, just to be autobiographical, the main reason comes from a recognition early in my academic life that almost everything I was taught in my youth about American history and the Constitution was not wholly historically accurate. Just wasn't accurate. In New Democracy, I associate early 20th century democratic reformers with an intellectual philosophy called American pragmatism. I actually prefer the word critical realism to what they're all about. A thoroughly modern, adult, mature, critical, and realistic perspective on law and the modern world, focused on social facts, right? Empirical social facts. Unfortunately, for those of us who came of age at the tail end of the so-called baby boom, critical realism was no longer ascendant in the United States. And instead, in the wake of intense ideological struggles, there are reasons for this, struggles against fascism, struggles against communism at mid-century, We late boomers were instead fed a steady diet of American exceptionalism. That was the credo of this era, the credo of my youth. Here, American history was portrayed as a city on a hill, morning in America, alternative to the statist traditions that were seen as ravaging mid-20th century Europe. American history as an almost sacred freedom narrative. Happy to talk more about this in Q&A. The consensus school, the invention of the whole field of American studies in the 1950s to see America as different, as special, as exceptional, unlike Europe, unlike the rest of the world, emphasizing the US primarily as a land of individual rights, self-reliance, voluntarism, entrepreneurship, anti-statism, private property, liberty of contract, free market. Of course, you all know this as something of a cartoon, but it's amazing to me the degree to which this caricature makes its way rather consistently to the core of 2 generations of some of our most sophisticated American political and constitutional histories. And in my opinion, this post-war vision still accounts for some of the wild disagreements and historical misconstruals that I think continue to fan the flames of some of our most volatile political disagreements today. We just have different pictures of American history in our heads that seem to be clashing, and it seems to be a very important fundamental clash of opposites. From the anti-statism of Ronald Reagan's first inaugural, right? Government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem, right? The founders actually, the revolutionaries didn't think that. They knew they had to start governing if they had any chance of beating the British, right, in that particular era. To the Tea Party movement, to today's anti-vaxxers or anti-maskers, to the thoroughgoing present-day assault in real time on the modern administrative state, right? This anti-statism is real, it's a real thing. I would argue it's rooted in a certain conception of history that we historians are obligated to scrutinize and to be critically realist about. We are only all too aware of just how many Americans remain profoundly, sometimes militantly, sometimes violently unreconciled to the kinds of modern governmental, economic, and social regulation that has simply pervaded American legal and political development from its very inception. Right? That's an interesting thing to talk about, of where we get this opposition to this thing that's been created over 200 years. I would love to speculate more on that with you in a second. So I have to admit, in the beginning, I was myself a skeptic, right? I was of this early American regulatory tradition. Like most boomers, for a while, I drank the Kool-Aid. Quite literally, we drank Kool-Aid back then. This was, anything instant, prepackaged, artificial, canned, right? This was our steady diet of these things. But as I entered a kind of PhD program and started to dig into the empirical record, these books are all available. They're right there for everyone. They're now digitally available. You don't have to go into the library at all. The sources on American history, just the legal and ubiquitous legal and state regulation kind of overwhelmed me, both on the social side and the economic side, sometimes for good, sometimes for not. I can come down on both sides of that question, as I hope we discuss as well. I just found more and more, though, overwhelming evidence that the historical reality on the ground was just markedly different from reigning mythologies and from the things I was taught. Most obviously, the policing of slavery, immigration, the removal of native peoples and free people of color were not products of laissez-faire or a society with a general predisposition to leave people alone. That just ain't going to happen if that's true. I like to remind folks that in John Stuart Mill's supposedly libertarian classic On Liberty, his favorite examples of governmental overreach came not from Europe, they came from the US. Liquor regulation, Sabbath regulation, and the persecution of the Mormons. These are the things Mill in his libertarian tract was worried about. One can hardly explain, I think you'll agree with me, the rise of American military power, commercial development, the role of incarceration in the United States, the exceptional role of the death penalty in the United States, racial segregation, the growth of executive emergency and war powers of the kind I started this talk with in the Wilson administration in American public life, by clinging to Cold War fables of exceptionalism, voluntarism, and rugged individualism. The myths have to go, and one of my goals in writing 3 books about this is to speed that process along. Again, we can have different perspectives on it, but my goal is let's get the empirical record straight. Let's strip away some of the myth, falderall, and claptrap that sometimes keeps us from seeing what actually goes on. And of course, nowhere have origin myths, founding fables, stork fibs, and Peter Pan legends grown up more thickly in legal constitutional history than in some of the fantastical and exceptionalist tales we spin about the American Revolution and the so-called, this is an actual title, miracle at Philadelphia. It was a miracle. For Clinton Rossiter, this seed time of the Republic marked nothing less than the very origin of the American tradition of liberty, featuring constitutional fundamentals like natural law and the rights of man that American people still cherish as their most precious intellectual possession. I'm going to unfairly take a couple shots at some of my earlier historical forebearers. And this is on YouTube, but these are nuanced historians, but sometimes they say some unnuanced things, and I'm going to repeat them here. Oscar Hanlon concurred, noting from the pulpit, through the press, and the flood of pamphlets, the revolutionaries pointed their discussion to the ultimate issue of rights. These are rights revolutions. Hanlon's student, Bernard Bailyn, similarly highlighted the important shift circa 1760 toward what he dubbed the alienation of the state. In excavating the intellectual, in nuanced ways of excavating the intellectual origins of American revolutionary pamphlets, Bailyn did fixate particularly on the overriding influence of what he called 18th century radical libertarianism. And the central theme is a direct quote, that power is evil and that it must be controlled, limited, restricted in a way compatible with only a minimum of civil order. The road from this understanding of the original revolutionary moment to the constitutional limitations imposed at Philadelphia, in other words, is short and direct. Again, these are Bailyn's words: written constitutions, separation of powers, bills of rights, limitations on executives, on legislatures and courts, all express the profound distrust of power that lies at the ideological heart of the American Revolution and that has remained with us as a permanent legacy ever since. Gordon Wood continues some of these themes as well. Quote, the most liberal-minded of the 18th century tended to see society as beneficent and government as malevolent. Indeed, this overriding narrative of an essentially weak 18th century alienated state and liberty against government, liberty against statecraft, prevailed through Bernard Bailyn's very last written words on the revolution. Quote, the essential spirit of 18th century reform, its determination to protect the individual from the power of the state, lived on and lives on still. Okay, last written words by a major authority on this period. Well, I'm hesitant to go too far here, but in contrast to this kind of fairly long and distinguished tradition, I'm trying to investigate the degree to which American independence and the early constitutional formation of this period was worked out against a background assumption of a strong state and surprisingly interventionist efforts in social and economic policy. And following the lead of this World War I primary source, I'm starting that investigation with the actual output of the very first American legislatures and councils and committees. Now, starting with the revolutionary state legislatures might strike many as an unusual choice. After all, conventional wisdom on America's founding era legislatures has not been flattering, to say the least. Drifting toward anarchy is John Fisk's original appraisal of the critical period in United States history before we form the Constitution, right? Featuring a veritable chaos of state reprisals, quarrels, retaliatory measures, failures, financial distress, rag money, insurrection, and Barbary pirates. A really negative portrait of what's going on in the states. Indeed, something of a high point of this negative verdict was reached in no doubt a document you all know, Madison's famous memorandum on the vices of the political system of the United States, which are vices of the states and vices of state legislatures. The core of Madison's memo on the eve of the Philadelphia Convention was essentially a screed aimed at these overreaching state legislatures. Madison excoriated state legislation with some of the most extreme adjectives I could imagine. Evil, malady, a nuisance, pestilent, vicious, a snare, injustice, defect, alarm. If you're writing a memorandum, a white paper, these are probably not words we would use today. This is the rhetoric, the strategic use of language to sort of create power and create momentum for a particular agenda. The list of strange descriptors goes on. Madison's thoroughgoing critique of founding state legislatures condemned them to a status of censure, neglect, and really political vilification from which they've never fully recovered. Strangely, Madison's vices memo in a lot of conventional histories is frequently joined with an even worse source, in my opinion. There's a quotation that's often out there in these classic sources about early American legislatures that comes from another famous critic, James Iredell, North Carolina Attorney General, and later Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. In 1780, Iredell called the output of the North Carolina state legislature, quote, the vilest collection of trash ever formed by a legislative body. And historians trot this out all the time to explain the road to Philadelphia. That single quote has played an outsized evidentiary role in all kinds of orthodox accounts of the defects of the critical period and the need for a new constitution in Philadelphia. Now, this is where I don't trust some of these rhetorical sources. When you read these quotes, look at the footnotes, see where it's from, and now we have a digitized universe. Go back to the actual source yourself and read it in context, okay? Because Iredell's extreme conclusion about the North Carolina legislature was not the product at all of a close study of what's going on in those legislatures. It was dicta from a May travel letter home to his wife, Hannah Iredell. Yes, a letter home to his wife during an especially arduous sojourn away from home. And in the late 18th century, these are all arduous sojourns away from home. And the psychology of the letter away from your beloved, as you all probably are aware, is to make it clear to them that everything is just miserable in their absence, right? You've written these letters. You've read these letters, right? This is what happens. Of course, that's what Iredell is saying. His letter is a litany of complaint detailing his arrival in New Bern. These are quotes, after an infinite deal of difficulty and trouble. Iredell complained about the weather, the roads almost impassable, the distance long, the rivers unfordable, the bridges torn up, the mill dams broke, the circuit disagreeable, expenses monstrous, the circumstances of continental troops a melancholy account, his companion, Mr. Williams, severe inflammation in his eyes and pain in his head, and the doctor's wife, quote, one of the fattest women I have ever seen. You get the point. The letter is self-consciously exaggerated in tone and content. It would be a huge mistake to say that this is a critical, realist, pragmatic reflection on what the North Carolina legislature is. In fact, no historian quotes the next line of the letter, which is wrote that his assessment was the product of, quote, skimming over the laws so far as a very few minutes would permit me. No evidence at all that the collection of trash is coming from an objective investigation. So let me suggest that it might be high time to move away from frequently strategic, easily accessible rhetoric of such literary and letter sources from famous founders, even beyond the Big Six, and to pay more attention to what the very first state legislatures and committees are actually doing. Such new emphasis, I think, on the actual practices of our first independent body's politic highlights the unprecedented popular demands for public provisioning and governmental administration in society and economy during a period of war and a near constant crisis. Sometimes when you read literature on the state, people posit this idea that there are state builders out there who are building this, or bureaucrats who are building the state for their own authority and power. That's not how it happens, right? If you look for the origins of these policies, usually there's a problem. There's a reason we built these institutions. There's a reason we institute these regulations. Sometimes we pass the usefulness of those regulations, but it's not because some state builders want to build states through regulations, right? It's because there are problems on the ground that need to be addressed. And boy, were there problems on the ground in the very first days of the American Revolution. And states like, here's an example from New Jersey, all kinds of emergency acts. I'll just give you, to prohibit the exportation of provisions, to prevent the distilling of wheat, rye, and other grain, again, alcoholic beverages. All of these things are familiar to me from 19th century and 20th century regulation, which is what made it impossible for me not to go back here. Restrain the exportation of pitch, tar, and turpentine. Encourage the making of salt, again with the salt. Erect salt works, public works and public utilities here. Procure clothing for regiments, of course. Regulate and limit the prices of sundry articles of produce, manufacture, and trade. Preventing, here's a more common law, restrictions on trade. Forestalling, regrading, and engrossing. Basically, take people buying cheap and selling dear. It's now the American way of economic life, right? It's what you're supposed to do. Prohibited in common law, and they're passing more regulations. Empower a commission. Empower a commission. Delegate power to an administrative entity to take possession of the Andover Iron Works in time of war, to encourage the manufacture of paper, to regulate the limit the price of labor, and to prevent the withholding from sale of necessaries of life. If you have necessaries that people need, you are not allowed to not let the people have them. While such statutory overviews, I think, are suggestive in providing introductory insight into the range of legislative, regulatory, administrative action in this period, in examining these this early period, I think it's even more important not just to look at the state legislatures, but I like, and where I am right now in the sources, are these very first legislative and administrative bodies, the so-called provincial congresses and the committees of safety. So let me check the time and then just give you a little bit about this. So provincial congresses, occasionally called conventions, were the first independent legislative bodies established in 10 of the 13 colonies after the collapse of British rule, the formal dissolution of colonial assemblies and or the flight of royal governors from 1774 to 1776. In Massachusetts, the provincial congress is formed at Salem in 1774 after it was driven from its ancient seat in Boston by General Gage, who dissolved the general court. Okay, so official legislative power is gone. What do we do? The Congress built upon several spontaneous conventions of the people that rose up in western Massachusetts counties, where delegates of towns and districts met in private homes, courthouses, and committees of correspondence to build support for a more provincial assembly to meet the exigencies of our particular public moment. The first provincial Congress of Massachusetts had to meet irregularly, owing to the wartime conditions. Didn't know where it could meet, didn't know where it's going to meet the enemy. Convening on Salem only on one day, October 7th. At Concord from October 11th to October 14th. At Cambridge, again, just for a handful of days before dissolving on Saturday, December 10th, 1774. There were representatives from 12 counties, over 200 towns. Indeed, the American state provincial congresses have far greater levels of representation and participation than any of the previous legislatures. They created an original committee to report on the state of the province and the necessities of the situation, reporting on, and here's that point about, the reason we build state regulatory power is there are problems to be solved. People are suffering. Here's what they say: the distressed and miserable state of the province. Right? It would have been easy to have laissez-faire here. We would have been defeated, and the province would have remained miserable and in a state of distress. And noting a determination to now provide some adequate remedies for preventing impending ruin and providing for the public safety, the public welfare, the salus populi. In but its first days, the session of the First Provincial Congress quickly resolved that constables, sheriffs, tax collectors should not turn over any provincial monies in their possession to crown officers. These are aggressive measures, and devised measures for identifying and punishing rebels against the state. Committees were appointed to investigate the state of the army, to report on what was necessary for defense. And then the Congress met with overseers of the poor in Boston to discuss means for preserving the health and safety of the town during this crisis, to provide for the people, if you will. The Congress organized a boycott of East India teas and recommended that every town shall establish a committee to publish the names of any locals who shall sell or consume so extravagant or unnecessary an article of luxury. Okay? Sumptuary legislation regulating what people can consume. The list goes on and on. I don't have to tell you, provisioning the military. I go out with a long list of the names of these of the defense armaments necessary for the revolution. I'll spare you that. Beyond military production, there was also a concern at both the county conventions to encourage so-called domestic manufacturers. This is important. It's not just wartime emergency. We can talk about that in discussion, but they want to encourage domestic production. And this is what they meant by independence, that the state of Massachusetts, the state of Virginia would not be dependent on these extractive imperial countries around the globe, that we would actually be able to produce the goods themselves here, and that's going to take some governmental promotion to promote manufacturers, arts, and industry, even in wartime. They're already setting up this agenda, which will pour into kind of 19th century industrial policy and 20th century industrial policy as well. Drawing again on rich legal traditions and vocabularies that ultimately underwrite 19th century American state police powers, the Provincial Congress held that every state ought to regulate their own internal police. Right? That's independence, in such a manner as to furnish for themselves, within their own body politic, every necessary article for subsistence and defense, and thus to encourage manufacture, agriculture, and the economy, so as to render this state independence. Not freedom from government, not the alienation of the state, but freedom to govern themselves as an independent polity and entity. They go on passing all kinds of measures for concerning, right, it's a time of war. They're passing measures for the breeding of sheep, the raising of hemp and flax, preferable use of domestic wools, reasonable prices for those goods, increases. They want to promote the manufacture of nails, steel, tin plate, saltpeter, and glass. And likewise, the Congress endorsed, here it is early in American history, a public utility for encouraging as public utilities hornsmiths, wool combers, textile manufacturers, and the raising and curing of matter. And here my lack of 18th century, if anyone knows what that is, please let me know what the raising and curing of matter is. But they're very concerned about it and for introducing and establishing such arts and manufactures. So they're also concerned about culture and arts, right? Almost every aspect of regulation is there in its infancy. Okay, last point. Doesn't start just with the provincial congresses. My favorite find in this, some of you know about this already, but I hope to sort of highlight it perhaps more than we have in the past. Provincial congresses can't do everything, right? Massachusetts is running around from place to place, meeting for 2 days here, 3 days there. So what they do is they delegate authority, open-ended, plenary, discretionary power to various kinds of committees. Now, when discussing the role of committees in the American Revolutionary governance, I'm sure you all know it. You've heard about these committees. Unfortunately, our fourth grade teachers usually talked about these committees in terms of committees of correspondence. These are letter writers, they're philosophers, they're poets, they're writing letters. That's what the revolution is about. There's a commonplace in grammar school accounts of the coming of independence. And in consequence, many Americans grow up thinking about the revolution, as I said before, as something akin to a literary event where American luminaries of letters debate the finer points of early modern English political philosophy and English constitutional history. But the dangers of such a blinkered perspective, I think, were captured long ago by one Evangeline Walker Andrews, who cautioned that the founders were, quote, engaged in real rebellion and revolution, and not in a kind of parlor warfare described in many of our textbooks. This is a very old text, in which highly cultivated and periwigged American gentlemen of unquestioned taste and morality debate abstract principles of democratic government. That's not what happened, and yet so many of our histories are full of the periwigged Big Six and their letters and their correspondence and their speeches debating matters of kind of political and constitutional history. Again, without taking anything away from that, I think that's really important, but maybe we should spend some time changing the emphasis. If you want to know what people are about, don't look at what they're saying, look at what they're doing and the kinds of laws they're passing. So the committees that I want to talk about are not the committees of correspondence, which are there, which are important. They're the committees of safety, sometimes also known as, quote, committees of inspection, committees of observation, surveillance, commissions for detecting and defeating conspiracies. One historian, there's a couple great dissertations out there that should get more attention, haven't yet. Joshua Connolly, terrific dissertation on these committees. American dictators, he dubbed these committees at the state level in New York, Virginia, and New Jersey that assisted the war effort, regulated the economy, and policed internal dissent. Such policing of dissent included, this is Connolly's list, monitoring habitants' movements, confiscating their mail, stifling free speech, extending oaths, interrogating the accused, summoning the suspicious, apprehending potential subversives, deporting residents, paroling neighborhoods, and sometimes even jailing those they deemed enemies. Again, I have more detail. I'm going to skip over in the interest of time because I really want to hear and leave time to talk to you all as well. But this very much kind of fits as well the role of the committees of safety in confiscating loyalist property. And again, we have some historians who have worked on this pretty well. Dan Hulsebosh, Howard Pashman, pretty good stuff here. And of course, when you're confiscating, unfortunately, property in the southern states, we're talking about the committees of safety, confiscating enslaved peoples, right? So this is a very heavy-handed and very troubling kind of state action. Again, scholars have traced some of the roots of these committees of safety back to the English Civil War, as well as to colonial efforts for internal police and the like. But of course, you probably know them best, a committee of safety from the French Revolution, which we frequently contrast with the American Revolution. There's no question. Benjamin Franklin is the head of the Committee of Safety in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. And he's beloved in France and no doubt informs them about the role of committees of safety in revolutionary action and has some effect, no doubt, on Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety, which is different, but has similar kind of genealogy, okay? Again, the committees of safety instantly start elaborating on the agendas set by the provincial congresses. I'll just give you a couple more examples. You know, when you spend a long time in history, you know, I lived in Boston for a while. I did the Freedom Trail, you know, and you just, what could be? You know, do I really have to hear about Lexington and Concord again? When you read about it, when the provincial Congress gets information of what happened, like, you're reading about it almost like in real time as these people are, and that's kind of exciting. This is a big deal, and these Congresses and these committees know that they're at war, know that their people are being killed, and they're going to respond. So that Lexington and Concord actually gets South Carolina into the business of provincial congressing and also putting together its Committee of Safety. And they do all the things I've already talked about, regulating all kinds of products, beef, wheat, flour, rice. They also showed a keen interest in policing opinion and loyalty. Oh, I'll give you this little story here. This is one of my favorite from the record of what these committees of safety are doing. They're like administrative bodies, legislative bodies, judicial bodies. They're doing all sorts of things. Early on, July 18th, 1775, the Council of Safety in South Carolina receives a report from the Committee for St. Paul's Parish. So there are local committees and there are state committees of a proceeding and sentence. What the heck is this? Against one Charles Webb for, quote, malicious expression against the lieutenant governor and the committees of the province. So this guy's attacking the committees. According to the affidavits, Webb declared in public company in a public tavern on the very day of British hostilities against Boston that, quote, he was now to go to England to take a commission and come back and fight the Americans. Later that day, he was accused of calling the lieutenant governor, quote, a damned fool for not hoisting the king's standard. And in the context of a further dispute over a past due account in the settlements of debts, the committee summons him in this debt collection proceeding. Webb attacks the committee itself distinctly as I love this language, a set of mechanical, ignorant rascals. Here's the class element, right? Butchers, tailors, and cobblers. Who are you people? You're not the elites, right? Why should we listen to you? He further hoped that men of war would take the delegates prisoners of war, carry them back to England, where they will be treated as rebels, noting how pretty the foolish rascals of property would look when their lands and their slaves come to be forfeited to the king. These are the stakes on the ground in these committees. In a final attack, Webb suggested that it was a pity there was not a gallows erected in Charleston to hang all the Americans in a string. As for the committee, they were a lousy set, blackguards such as butchers and tailors. It goes on and on. It's just butchers and tailors. In consequence, the chairman of the St. Paul's Parish Committee of Safety ordered Webb guilty of the accusation and an enemy to the province and an enemy to America. All in this not legal proceeding, right? Not legislative proceeding, but this kind of delegated discretionary proceeding. Okay, just two more points. While detailed descriptions of the actual enforcement of loyalty oaths and the policing of dissent by committees of safety are harder to find in the extant primary sources, the account of one Janet Shaw in her Journal of a Lady of Quality has been seized on by historians for more granular detail. So Wilmington, North Carolina also forms a committee of safety in 1775, imposes an oath of allegiance. They also voted that now its members of the committee should go quickly through the town to canvass householders' signatures so as to know who their friends and who their enemies are. 11 merchants and planters in Wilmington, North Carolina refused to sign. They were immediately boycotted, and things escalate from there. Here's Janet Shaw in her journal describing walking into Wilmington in the midst of the chaos. Entry to the town, she said, was closed up by a detachment of soldiers. This is the war. This is rebellion. But she was allowed to pass. Once in town, she noticed several acquaintances, but who she now recognized were prisoners. Every avenue of the town was shut up by soldiers, she recalled, and in all human probability, some scene was going to be played out there, unfit, she says, for me to witness. I became unable to move and absolutely petrified with horror. This is war. It's a revolution. It's a rebellion. It's not a literary play. According to the royal governor, a large band of local soldiers and militia had actually threatened resistors with military execution. Shaw recounted that the prisoners at first stood firm of not signing the test till past 2 a.m. They were then paroled till the next morning. Ultimately, however, there's a report of the endgame in 1775 where the royal governor reports that the Scot merchants at Williamton, who so long maintained their loyalty to Britain, have now been compelled, ostensibly from the royal perspective, to join in the sedition by appearing under arms at the musters appointed by the committee. Okay, so to conclude, from socioeconomic provisioning, domestic necessities, military mustering, property confiscation, the policing of dissent, the first record of America's very first independent governing bodies, provincial congresses, and committees of safety is one of startling power and force. But let me conclude with even a more general and perhaps more presentist observation about America's original history and traditions, as I do think it's important now to go back and get the founding correct in our current moment. As you're all no doubt well aware, in June 2022, the United States Supreme Court momentously and surprisingly, in my opinion, elevated the status of my field, American legal history, to new heights of significance in contemporary constitutional jurisprudence. In his majority opinion in New York State Rifle v. Bruin, Clarence Thomas used the words history or historical more than 100 times, okay, in establishing the centrality of, quote, this nation's historical tradition in determining the scope of now contemporary Americans' constitutional rights. Samuel Alito resorted to those same words over 50 times in Dobbs, and similarly holding that any judicially recognized constitutional right must be deeply rooted in this nation's history and traditions. An analysis founded on original meaning and history, Neil Gorsuch argued in Bremerton, was key as well to unlocking an establishment clause, which he argued must be interpreted by reference to early historical practices and understandings. The June 2022 cases, in other words, are all testament to the ever-increasing significance and importance of getting our nation's legal and constitutional history correct. And yet, I would argue, as we prepare to celebrate, here's a tough word, the semi-quincentennial, bicentennial was much easier, right? It's the get it down now, you have a little time to get this under your belt. Semi-quincentennial or quarter millennium, 250-year anniversary of our Declaration of Independence from England. I think that particular job of just trying to get our law and history right has never been more difficult or fraught. As none other than Friedrich Hayek once put it, historical myths have played perhaps nearly as great a role in shaping opinion here as historical facts. So let me stop there and look forward to your comments, criticisms, knowledge of 18th century history. Oh, there you go.
All right. Give another warm round of applause for Bill Novak. All right, so as is tradition here at Kinder, we will have the first question start off with a student. So please, students of all kinds, raise your hands.
Thank you so much. This was a great talk. I just have a quick question about where potentially like piracy, privateering falls into this narrative. You mentioned the state regulatory ability to kind of oversee all the trade aspects, especially domestically. But when you have a massive incoming of illegal, illicit trade, where does this fall into this narrative, and have you seen it across your studies?
You know, it doesn't show up so far in the provincial congresses or the committees of safety that I've looked at so far. It's there. As you make clear, it's very much reflective of this as a time of war in which you're concentrating on particular priorities and there's all kinds of smuggling, there's all kinds of illicit activity going on. Andrew Cohen has a really wonderful book. It's in a later period, but it has a little bit on the earlier period. He concentrates on smuggling. The book is actually about tariffs, but he didn't know tariffs were going to be so important again in American history. So he couched it and sold it as a book about smuggling. But that's all there. And then one thing I hope to do in this book is start with the very first legislative bodies in the United States after independence. I hope to finish with the first U.S. statutes at large. Because when you see that first Congress, and they're going to take this issue very serious. They're going to assert their power over the seaboard trade They're going to do things. You might, if you were looking at these statutes or just the titles of the statutes, you might brush right by this thing. One of their very first concerns of the first Congress, which includes many of the people that were at Philadelphia drafting the Constitution, is to pass a statute regarding beacons and buoys and lighthouses. That seems strange to us. Why is it not strange? Precisely because by the time we get the first Congress, they're very concerned now with buttoning up. This is a commercial economy. It's a maritime economy. We've got to get order on the high seas. It's a terrific book out there by Scott Shapiro and Ona Hathaway called The Internationalists, which starts with Grotius, who's very concerned about the law of free seas and sees a whole pathway of kind of modern international law right to our very present, bound up in this question that starts with the seas. So terrific question. Good book. I'd recommend to you.
Thank you for this very energizing talk. I just wanted to invite you to say a little bit about federalism and what should we make of the fact that what you're talking about is largely local committees and state legislatures. Is there something going on in American history where we're quite comfortable when kind of local committees exercise all sorts of police powers, and we hold kind of the federal government maybe to a different account? So.
Fabulous question that extends throughout the whole arc of my work. I mean, this is the most difficult question for, political theorists to try to figure out. Political theorists have talked about this for 200, 300 years. That we might know how to do sort of democracy and self-governance at a very local, homogeneous level where all the people agree about certain things. What gets hard is scaling up the project of self-governance or self-regulation or self-administration or self-legislation to higher and higher levels. But if you want the story, you've just suggested it. I think in the 18th century, at least among the future Americans, very much focused on local self-governance, the New York town meeting, the power of these kind of local committees. They know exactly what they're doing because they've been doing it for 150 years. They've been practicing this before they have to put it into place. Then the story is in the 19th century, moving that open-ended, what's called state police power to the state level. And that creates all kinds of problems depending on what you're regulating. It'll lead the road to the Civil War and the 14th Amendment to restrain the powers of the state and enhance the power of the federal government. Another effort now to scale up to the federal level. I would argue that's the most difficult thing imaginable. How do you scale this kind of open-ended, self-regulating, self-legislating police power up to the federal level in a large country with a very diverse population, divided by federalisms of geography and jurisdiction and boundaries and ways of life? It's the most difficult problem imaginable. And it's one of the reasons there's such, I think, pushback or blowback in our own current moment is people are uncomfortable with the scaling up that has happened and want to retreat perhaps into a more decentralized format. I think that'll have some effects for the time being, and maybe that's just the future. Maybe the EU, the fate of the EU is a sense that we can't scale these things up at the rate at which we thought. The fate of international law, that we might not be able to scale this kind of regulation up to an international level. That certainly does seem to be the trend, but boy, is there going to be opposition to that because it's such a difficult and fraught, I think, process.
Okay,
An 18th century historian. Okay, now I'm nervous.
18th century historians. So, though great talk, great project. I mean, I think it's not stuff that says unknown to 18th century historians as some of the bicentennial quotations you're throwing out might suggest. But I guess what I wonder about it is, do you think there's a problem with throwing the toggle switch? In other words, small government, large government, super powerful government. You know what I mean? I mean, it's useful as an argument, but like for instance, the quotations that Madison's memo, Iredell's letter, and then I don't know if you realize that senator who criticized Woodrow Wilson, that's a Missouri.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, that's good. That's very fitting.
Senator Pendergast.
Awesome.
Senator June Reed, who really did hate Wilson. But my question is, those criticisms are real and they're made, right? So is there a thing about theory versus practice? I mean, this is a little bit related to Larry's federalism question. I mean, I wonder if it doesn't do to like, okay, there's wartime emergency stuff that was done, and they do all these incredible things that seem very modern, and they do those things, but at the same time, they generate powerful criticisms, which then get embodied into other documents and larger traditions.
Yep.
And that maybe it's a battle,
Yep.
rather than we have a myth of weak government that we need to show. And I guess I also just thinking in modern terms, right? That your book, right? That's a book that you can throw at various people, but Trump might like to throw that book at us, right? You know what I mean? Emergency legislation. I mean, in other words, the libertarian
executive orders,
the
proclamations.
libertarian tradition cuts both ways. I mean, it's quite right that it's challenged, that it's not as complete as we think, that it's not as unchallenged. But I guess this is more of a comment than a question. But I guess what do you want to do with the debate? Is that going to be part of this project? Because I guess to me, this kind of thing is going to be much more convincing if it doesn't become the thing. Well, we don't have to get into his name. The thing where you say, you know what, the gun legislation that was different back then. It's like gun rights as we know it now, that didn't exist back then, and you know what? Neither did guns.
That was bad empirical history.
No,
that wasn't social
that was
facts.
bad empirical history,
yeah.
but it was also, it's the toggle switch I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Where instead of just saying, okay, the history of guns and guns rights is much more complicated than you all realize, and let's go back and talk about it in a nuanced way. We say, here's a myth, and I'm going to like blow it up. And then resulting in people counter-mything and
Sure.
the whole thing not making much progress.
Well, and this is playing out in real time in so-called historians' amicus briefs before the U.S. Supreme Court, where you have the briefs on both sides and cherry-picking historical evidence and making.
Yes.
I don't want to do that. So what I hope is that I would be very happy with a rebalancing of the discussion, right? I just think the hegemony of this kind of liberal rights model has just, as the only story, as the foundational story, has just held center stage for too long. And I think we're getting close to being able to rebalance it. And I think it's really important to go back and rebalancing it, especially in the founding. Because I think you're exactly right. Those things are there. Both things are there simultaneously, and they have actions and reactions. So let me retreat to a period in which I'm more comfortable. So Wilson does this. There's a lot of bad stuff, right? I mean, just incredible suppression, doing some of the stuff the revolutionary legislatures are, opening the People's Mail, the Postmaster General, segregating the Federal Employment Service, and just the deportation mania, the immigration restriction. It's quite extraordinary. And so one might want to see that as the logical culmination of a statist tradition. Woodrow Wilson did self-describe as a progressive. The first opponents to Woodrow Wilson immediately, of Woodrow Wilson asserting this presidential executive omnibus plenary power, are progressives, right? There are a bunch of Felix Frankfurter, Ernst Freund, Jane Addams, John Dewey say this is not the state we were talking. We were talking about a democratic state, not this kind of more authoritarian, executive-based kind of statecraft. Those people will go on to be part and parcel of the founding of the American Civil Liberties Union, and they too will understand the need to kind of put more checks and balances into this equation, that of course we need state power in a nation now of 330 million people with all kinds of benefits on the line, et cetera. But maybe we do also need to talk about where those checks and balances are. But following Hayek, I think we should do that on the basis of facts rather than fiction and mythology and stork fibs.
Here's the facts.
Here's the facts.
Hi, so
Hi.
there's a couple of us in this lecture right now that are in an executive power
Oh,
seminar.
excellent.
And so we've been kind of tracing the ebbs and flows of executive power from Lincoln to Wilson to
Excellent.
FDR, and now especially with Donald Trump. And so kind of trying to take this and project it to the modern day.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to know what you think about like this idea of, if we're thinking about executive power as ebbing and flowing and taking specifically like from the executive like emergency power record, if we're thinking about this from a legislative standpoint from the 18th century, and with how different states are trying to combat like this self-proclaimed emergency with like reproductive rights and immigration, do you think that is possible for local and state governments to start using this like legislative history of emergency powers to go maybe like against the executive power of proclaimed emergency?
So here's what I would say. Great question. I think question for our times. And a question about history, how history might inform our times and how we think about these questions. So all the examples sort of you gave really are of kind of presidential extent. They're all valid, right? I mean, Lincoln's by credible, theorists talked about the constitutional dictatorship. Wilson, no doubt. I'm on board with seeing this as a problematic authoritarian executive power grab. Franklin Roosevelt, as you probably know, especially by the time he pivoted to the war, comes under attack for beginning to wield power in ways that were analogous to sort of European, more authoritarian, executive-focused European regimes. So I think that the difference in that, so that's there. That's historical fact. Notably, even with these revolutionary legislatures, those are all moments of necessity or emergency, particularly mostly in Lincoln's case, where again, Congress wasn't instantly in session the way it can be called into session as Franklin Roosevelt did by turning the Great Depression into an emergency. But it might be one reason to think that that language of necessity and emergency might be the thing we really need to scrutinize as to whether there is in fact an emergency and whether the people, the democracy actually believes there is such a thing. Those other people have written on this. Carl Schmitt, a constitutional theorist of Nazi Germany. Giorgio Agamben, during the War on Terror, talked about some of these, the dangers of creating this open-ended power in a time of emergency. I would contend, as with the ACLU, as with the NAACP, by the way, which is a progressive era originating organization in 1909, that in fact that's precisely the reason people like Ernst Freund, Felix Frankfurter, Jane Addams, W.B. Du Bois talked about countervailing powers, talked about checks and balances, and through most of American history, I would say, invested in either congressional administration or legislative administration that was less prone to kind of manipulation as compared to kind of executive legislation, and independent administrative agencies. That's why they wanted expertise, independence, and public service as values. If we're going to create this bureaucracy, let's make sure it's checked and balanced and responsible. They would have preferred, when they created these independent agencies, congressional oversight, not a unitary executive theory. I think that's pretty clear historically. And let's really put real content into these values of expertise, reason, and enlightenment value, independence, so that these agencies aren't captured by any one set of kind of political actors at a moment in time. And let's revitalize our conceptions of public service, right? At the end of the day, if we don't have an autonomous, substantive concept of what it means to serve the public in public office, as Aristotle knew long ago, the public realm will be used for private purposes. It will be corrupted to private ends, right? And so there are alternatives. There are ways to build in these kind of checks and balances, these guardrails. Levitsky and Ziblatt, I don't know if you're reading How Democracies Die, but I think they're very compelling on precisely the need to set up these constitutional guardrails and not allow power to agglomerate, as we know it does around the world, in these kind of ways that can be quite detrimental to democracy.
Yes, I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions.
Okay.
Thanks for that, Bill. You're an absolute pro. That was fantastic stuff. First, quick comment. J. Reuben Clark. I don't know if you know much about him, but is he the guy?
Only that he wrote the book.
Okay. He's like a serial offender. He's a recidivist of doing that kind of thing.
For the Wilson administration.
Yeah, and he's most famous for the Clark Memoranda, which is the first compilation of all the invocations of the Monroe Doctrine. And in that case, he is quite, accurately, but selectively advancing a particular vision. And it sounds like he's probably doing the same in this instance. So what's the difference between Clark and your Cold War exceptionalists? I mean, aren't they crafting or using history to advance a particular end? And here we like Clark, but we don't like Balin, but they're guilty of the same things. That's my comment. My question, golly, there's a very similar historical debate about the Confederacy in the days of the Civil War and the way in which an anti-statist political culture gives way to the imperatives of war, and you have this Confederate state doing unimaginable. Actually, the Confederate state looks more like the Great War state than does the Union. But where that literature, I think, ultimately went, rather than to point out the hypocrisy of these Confederates, was to say, the point that Jeff raised about the debate and the social conflict, placing that at the center and saying that actually the overreach of the Confederate state led to meaningful dissent, which undermined the war effort. I'm taking you to be saying here, actually, the aggressive actions of these colonial or early state assemblies don't overreach, or they're in some way able to harness public opinion and mobilize public support, of course, by kicking out all the loyalists. I mean, that seems like a key piece of the argument. But I guess what I'm trying to get at, sorry for the long question,
no, it's a good question.
Trying to spit out is if instead of the ultimate objective is to trace the growth of the state, is it big, is it small, think about what is it doing and how is it managing a very difficult political tightrope walking act. And it seems like there's still a lot to be said about kicking out loyalists, about balancing difficult political calculations at home. So that and J. Reuben Clark.
I'm totally with you. This is exactly where I'd like to go. So I would just say he includes includes Confederate legislation. He does, It's not as much, but it's in there as well. I'm glad I found this. This could be the end of your investigation. I think this is what happens in these wars of amicus briefs. Oh, I've got some citations here, and this is my argument, right? And not being aware, of course, that this is strategically assembled for particular reasons. As you might know, some law firms are getting cited for. AI can do this too, but it frequently comes up with counterfeit citation. It looks damn good, but this is this kind of cherry picking of evidence to support an argument. I think this can only be like a start. All it can do is be a hint. It's a thing I'm glad I found on the shelf, and now I got to put it away and not look at it again and go back into the actual records to see. It gives you a hint that our standard orthodox conventional wisdom has some flaws in it, and now it's time to kind of build a more balanced story. I think that you can tell about this. Otherwise, I would just write this up and put it in a white paper and be done. But I agree, that's the task for this project. I think entering the next stages is look very closely at some of this gets really ugly. There are moments of crackdown on dissenters and loyalists. But it's very also focused on public provisioning for the towns, the overseers of the poor, and the committees are working with the overseers of the poor. And there's some dastardly moments in the committees of safety reports where the question comes up, when a loyalist soldier is off fighting, do the locals have to provision or help support the women and children left behind? Their answer is no. Let them starve is literally what these committees say. So yes, I'm going to be very careful about that balancing act of what they need to do. They do need to kind of create public utilities for the ironworks. We got to make sure that stuff is being produced, or you're going to lose the war. But we can draw those lines, as the progressives did when they formed the ACLU, said we've done a lot of state building. We better now sort of focus for the next 100 years on checking those kinds of extremities of authoritarian power. Time for war?
one last question.
Okay.
Okay.
Or
Let's,
not.
let's wrap it there. Let's once again give a warm round
Thank
of
you all. I
applause for Bill
appreciate
Novak.
it so much.
And before we all adjourn to happy hour, I've been charged with pleasantly charged with one note of logistics. Believe it or not, this is our penultimate Kinder Colloquium event of the year. The final such event is on Tuesday, May 13th at 6 p.m. at the Missouri Theater with NPR host Stephen Inskeep. So please do join us for the last big celebration for Kinder for the year. And with that, have a great Friday night, and let's have a Pursuit of Happiness hour.